Okay. That's allowed. So we should be good to go. One pen between presentations. Patty is going to sneak up and just change it so it'll be like 5 seconds. Okay. And I'm going to just actually introduce people as the first speaker. That's why I put it in order for you. Yeah.
So Katie was telling me how many staff you have down here. I had no idea.
Yeah, we
Once you have an office, there's a natural law that you fill it and then
Right,
some.
and then some. Then rent an auxiliary space, as we have done. Yes. We own 2 buildings free and clear, but no, that couldn't be enough.
Well, we've just today bought our 4th.
Oh, really? Good. Congratulations. Okay. All right. That's fine.
Oh, everybody's quieting down. I don't know. Got the mic on. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us here at AEI and braving the rain. I was afraid the rain might scare people off, but the brave souls that you are, you made it. I'm Andrew Kelly. I'm the director of the Center on Higher Education Reform here at AEI, also a resident scholar in the Department of Education's Policy Studies. And I am thrilled for the conversation today. I think it's a really opportune time to be talking about competency-based education. Few ideas have gotten as much attention from policymakers and foundations and policy wonks. And it's gotten attention for good reason. The trends in higher education are not particularly encouraging. Prices are sky high. Employers are complaining that they can't find recent college grads with the skills they need. And we have a bunch of reform energy around lowering the cost of delivery and supplying students with a clearer signal of what it is they know and can do. We also have a problem in that people are taking a lot longer to finish degrees than they used to. The completion rates are down and time to degree is longer. So that has sent us in search of ways to improve student progress and allow people to move more quickly. Basic idea of competency-based education, as most people in the room probably already know, is to, post-secondary education should clearly define and assess competencies. And then credit should be awarded on the basis of those competencies rather than the amount of time spent in class. Those are sort of the 2 key underpinnings, though as we found when we launched this project, it's a lot harder to define competency-based education than you might expect. A lot of different definitions, and I'm sure we'll get into some of that today. But it allows for progress, in theory, on 2 different dimensions, right? It allows students to move at their own pace, according to when they can pass an assessment and prove that they're competent or that they've mastered a given topic, allowing shorter time to degree, in theory. And then, of course, it also provides a clearer signal to employers about what you've mastered and what you're able to do. A set of institutions have been offering competency-based education for a long time, despite the zeitgeist around it. It's been around for a while. So colleges like Excelsior College, John Ebersol's here with us, Charter Oak State College in Connecticut, Thomas Edison State College in New Jersey, which is the alma mater of AEI's president, Arthur Brooks. Little known fact. And Western Governors University, which has been at this since the mid-'90s. And we've got a bunch of newcomers who are offering competency-based education as well now. College for America at Southern New Hampshire, the University of Wisconsin's flexible option. Northern Arizona has a program. The Kentucky Community College and Community and Technical College system has also experimented with CBE. Federal policymakers have recognized the regulatory environment is not particularly friendly to competency-based education as an idea. Credit hour tends to pose problems for people who want to provide programs under this format. So the Ed Department has been working on approving direct assessment models. They've approved a few. It hasn't been as smooth a process as I think people would hope, but there's progress there. And then recently, a bipartisan bill from Jared Polis and Matt Salmon from Arizona would allow up to 30 institutions to experiment with competency-based education. All this enthusiasm is fine and good. Reformers are excited about this. But we also need rigorous research on competency-based education. The research agenda has not necessarily kept pace with the policy reform agenda. And as a result, we actually still lack answers to basic questions about competency-based education. Questions like, what kinds of students are likely to enroll in competency-based education programs? Are competency-based models more affordable on average for students? How do competency-based models assess student learning? What does it actually look like under the hood? And how do employers view competency-based education and the credentials? The series of papers that we've put out here at AEI on competency-based education has been an effort to fill this gap, early initial steps, just some basic research questions. And today we'll hear from three of the authors. We've released 4 so far. There will be 2 more forthcoming. And we'll hear from 3 of the authors. We'll hear about the landscape of competency-based education. Who's offering it? What does it cost? What kinds of students are enrolled? We'll hear about what assessment looks like in competency-based education. And we'll also hear about the view from employers. And then we'll hear from 2 terrific discussants who are eminently qualified to remark both on the papers and on the status of competency-based education. What I'm going to do is introduce the authors and the speakers individually before they speak, so I won't go through all the bios now because that tends to be monotonous and bore everybody to tears. So I'll just introduce the authors as they go. But quickly, just a few ground rules before we start. It's being live streamed, and the full video will be available on the event page. So if you know anybody who wasn't able to make it today but wanted to, please send them an email and tell them to sign on to the live stream they can watch. Please silence all your cell phones. The Twitter hashtag for the event is #CBE@AEI. Alphabet soup hashtag, but that you're used to that if you work in education. So please tweet about the event as much as you'd like. And also feel free to tweet questions to the hashtag, and we'll try to maybe get some of those in during the Q&A. It'll proceed as follows. We'll hear from each of the speakers. They'll either present their paper or remark on the papers and the topic at hand. And then I'll do a few moderated questions from the podium, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. The rules for Q&A are very simple. Wait for the microphone. First, raise your hand. Wait for the microphone. Identify yourself by name and affiliation. And the most important rule is ask a question. No monologues. No soliloquies, no monologues. And no, just raising your voice at the end of the sentence doesn't count as a question. So those are the ground rules. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. We'll first hear from Robert Kelchin. Robert's an assistant professor of higher education in the Department of Education, Leadership, Management, and Policy at Seton Hall in my home state of New Jersey. Robert has a terrific blog on education. I recommend you all read it. Kelchin on Education, I believe it is. And Robert wrote a great paper for us that was released, I believe, in January on the landscape of competency-based education. So I'll hand it off to Robert.
All right, thank you, Andrew. And I have a tough act to follow, Andrew's congressional testimony yesterday.
Thanks.
And he made it out alive, so that's good. So I'm talking just a little bit about the landscape of competency-based education. Before this paper came out, there wasn't a systemic look at not only what is competency-based education, but who's offering various versions of it. And that's what I attempted to do in this work. And the landscape has changed even more since this paper was released, and I'll note that where appropriate. So first, what is competency-based education? It's controversial. People don't agree what should count. Should it be prior learning assessments? Do AP exams count as competency-based education? Credit by examination, portfolios? Or are we thinking about ways for students to master new content instead of things that they already learned in some way, shape, or form? I'm focusing more on the latter here, but both are certainly valid definitions of competency-based education, even if people disagree as to exactly what the definition should be. Also worth noting, many people think of competency-based education as being separate from the credit hour system. It doesn't have to be. For example, Alverno College in Wisconsin has been doing a version of competency-based education since the 1970s that's totally based on the traditional credit hour system. Who offers it? The number seems to grow by the week. I did a cutoff of spring 2014, and at that point, 34 colleges had competency-based in existence, with another 18 in development. And it's worth noting that these colleges are not going in alone often to develop competency-based education. There are various networks out there, such as the Competency-Based Education Network, that provide support for colleges looking to develop competency-based models. There are also various prior learning assessments. So there's CALE, Learning Counts, or individual course providers like Straighterline. There are various ways to get this competency-based education to students. And as of spring 2014, there were about 17 colleges that had at least one degree offering based on competency-based education for new learning. Some of these colleges are completely competency-based, and others are relying more on traditional methods for many programs. So I realize this is a little bit small on the screen, but I'll draw your attention to the top right here. That's what people think about as kind of the cutting edge for competency-based education. All the programs are competency-based in some way, and the tie to seat time is either low or non-existent, as compared to the top left with Alverno College, which is competency-based, but completely based on the credit hour system. And then there are colleges at the bottom left, that have one program that's a little bit more experimental, that's competency-based, and there are some interesting programs in the two-year sector on the bottom right that are competency-based, low seat time, but they're individual or a small number of programs at this point. Who takes competency-based education? We think of this as being done by returning adult students with significant life and work experience. The problem is it's hard to actually get data on these students. For the colleges where these students are included with the rest of the university that operates traditionally, we can't separate them out in federal data. But there are a number of colleges that we actually can, because the entire college is competency-based. Also worth noting, some colleges focus strictly on adult students. So Thomas Edison, unless there are special circumstances, requires students to be 21 years old, while traditional universities like focusing on the 18 and 19-year-old students. So I looked at 9 colleges that are completely competency-based by some definition. They had about 143,000 undergraduates in 2012, and this number has likely increased since then. Most of the students attend part-time. I say that with a little bit of a caveat because part-time for competency-based, when you're not based on a credit hour, is a little bit difficult to determine. You can say 6 credits traditionally is part-time, but how do you determine 6 credits or half-time in a situation where students aren't getting traditional credits? The group is racially, ethnically diverse. It's about 56% female, which is typical for higher education at this point, and the median age is 35. We don't know as much about socioeconomic status because not all these colleges at that time were able to give students Pell Grants. So we don't have that key indicator at some institutions. But this fits our general perception of competency-based students, older adults. When does competency-based education make sense? It makes sense if you can get students through faster and cheaper. Faster is important because if the students aren't in college studying, they could be working more, spending time with their family, or doing other things they might enjoy more than studying. But you also have to think about cheaper. The sticker price can matter. What's listed tuition and fees? But can you get financial aid? And that hasn't always been the case, which I'll talk about more in just a minute. These pricing plans for competency-based education vary. Prior learning assessments run from about $80 to $400 per 3 credits typically, which is less expensive than most four-year institutions. Students can earn credits via portfolio, which also, if you get more than 6 credits, is typically less expensive than earning them in traditional seat time-based models. Some of the newer competency-based programs have what I call all-you-can-eat program models, where you just complete as many courses as you can within a certain period. And the prices range from $2,500 a quarter at Capella to $2,500 a year at Southern New Hampshire. So if you can complete a lot of courses in a short period of time, this can be a very inexpensive way to get a degree. But not all these institutions have been able to offer their students federal financial aid. As Andrew talked about, there are a lot of hoops that colleges have to jump through and get approval from the Department of Education. And the Office of the Inspector General within the federal government has not always been happy with competency-based models because there are concerns about direct assessment and being able to measure student learning. But are we really that good at measuring student learning in traditional programs? As a faculty member, I know what I should say and what I'll actually say. They might be different things. But the Department of Education has been working to offer experimental sites. The bill that Andrew talked about offered 30 programs competency-based education. That bill never got through the Senate. So the department said, we'll do 40. And that's what's working on right now, including UW Flex option in Southern New Hampshire. If students don't qualify for Pell Grants and can finish in a relatively short period of time, competency-based education makes sense typically after about 6 to 9 credits per semester or semester equivalent. But if the Pell Grants are available, sorry for the typo, the number of break-even credits may be higher for some students. Also, if students are moving slowly under these competency-based models, they may be able to use Pell Grants or student loans quicker than their actual progress. So they may run out before they finish their entire program, particularly the 6-year Pell window or $31,000 or $57,500 in student loans. If you're taking 1 or 2 classes a semester, competency-based education might not be right for you. If you're moving quicker than that, it's probably a good bet. Quickly talk about Excelsior College and the Associate's Degree in Nursing program. Most of the students went through with credit by examination without taking a course. A smaller number of students did online courses only, and an even smaller number did a mix of exams and courses. It's a very diverse group of students, and a fair number of students with military experience. The way the pricing works is the nursing theory course costs $12.75 for 3 credits. The exam is $3.25. So if you can complete everything credit by exam without the online course, you save $7,600 for 8 classes. But if you do that in a year and get the maximum Pell Grant, the savings is smaller. But still, competency-based education through the credit by examination can make financial sense for students. What don't we know yet? We don't know a lot about what students actually learn, but we're working on it, and our next panelists will tell us more. Do people get labor market returns to competency-based education? There's an interesting story in the Chronicle this morning starting to get to that. How many students who complete competency-based would not complete college otherwise? Are we increasing educational attainment? And finally, can and should these programs be expanded to cover more students? And thank you to the people who helped me get up to speed quickly on this process.
Thank you, Robert. Lots of food for thought for the discussion, and I recommend you read Robert's paper. It really gets into detail on the different pricing models, and introduces a concept which I think is really interesting about the break-even point between a traditional model and a competency-based model, something that I hadn't seen before. So a terrific paper. Next, we're going to hear from Katie McClarty. Katie's the director of the Center for College and Career Success in Pearson's Research and Innovation Network, and she and her colleague Matt Gartner, who's out in the audience somewhere, wrote a terrific paper on assessment in competency-based education programs. Part of the reason I asked them to write this was because they are trained psychometricians, and a world that I know very little about. And I thought it would be a great opportunity for 2 people who are not directly working in the field of competency-based education to take a look at how the assessment process works there and sketch out some of the best practices that are industry standards, and give us a sense as to how close or far away some of the CBE programs are to these standards. So, Katie.
Thank you. As Andrew said, my colleague and co-author Matt Gartner is here, and we're happy to answer all sorts of exhilarating psychometric questions as they come up throughout the day. As we've talked about in traditional higher education programs, progress is measured based by accumulated credits, so seat time translated into credit hours. But in competency-based education, the focus is on demonstration of learning, on what students know and are able to do. But really, we think the quality and the credibility of that credential, of that diploma, is related to the measurement of learning. So when students are demonstrating the learning, how is that competency measured? And the quality of that measurement is directly important then to the quality of the associated credential. So in our paper, what we did was to review the current practices in competency-based education and compare those with a couple of industry best practices in terms of assessment development and processes for determining competency thresholds. And so what I want to do over the next couple minutes is introduce you to those best practices, to share some examples of where this has been well done in CBE programs, and to provide recommendations for the field moving forward. So we'll start with the assessment design, and here are 5 key areas for that. First is to have clearly defined competencies. Second is to have an explicit link between the assessment and those competencies. Third is to have a testing process that reflects those competencies. Fourth is that assessment performance should be similar on these assessments to performance on other assessments of those competencies. And then there should be a positive relationship between the assessment scores and future performance. And so I'll walk through each of those briefly. So here, thinking about clearly defined competencies, this is an example from Western Governors University from their Bachelor's of Science degree in accounting. And the way that they've structured it is for that degree program, they have a set of domains. And so there are 10 domains in accounting. There are only 2 up shown on the slide, but there are 10 domains. And then for each of those domains, they're further subdivided into a set of subdomains. And so this is a way that the competency framework is clearly articulated so that you know what skills students are needing to be able to demonstrate. The next step is to take a set of competencies and link those explicitly to an assessment. And so the example here I'm showing is from Southern New Hampshire University's College for America. And here's one of their assessment examples that looks at 2 specific competencies. Can use a spreadsheet to perform a variety of calculations, and can locate and use information in basic business documents such as manuals and reports. And so students are assigned an assessment task. One that goes with this one is to say, you are a new employee at a firm. The prior employee quit suddenly, and your job is to complete their task. You're given a partially completed spreadsheet, and you're given a business report, and your job is to sort of take on what they had and complete the task. So the student is given the directions, the task overview, the set of materials, the spreadsheet, and the business report. And then there's a set of evaluation criteria, and that's what they are specifically evaluated against to decide if they have mastered those competencies or not. And what you can see both through the task overview and through these evaluation criteria is clear links to those competencies of using the spreadsheet, performing calculations, and being able to locate and use information in that business report. So you can see a really nice alignment and link that lines the assessment to those competencies, and it's very explicit. The third part then is the actual testing process, or the activities that you do while testing should reflect the competency. For example, if you have a competency about critical thinking or reasoning, you want to be able to show that students have to demonstrate those competencies, critical thinking or reasoning, to successfully complete the task, and it's not some other thing that they're and be successful. It needs to be those competencies. And I think the easiest example here is I took one from Advanced Placement, the music theory assessment. So they've got 2 parts. One is about aural skills, and so students listen to a piece of music and they have to write the notes. The second part of that assessment is about sight singing, and so they're given a piece of sheet music and have to sing into a recorder. And so it gives a clear example of how, so long as you have novel music that students don't know about, you can test that listening or that sight as opposed to memory or some other skill. So again, being clear that what students are doing during the activity of testing is actually doing the competency that you think you're measuring. The last 2 pieces of assessment design I think are critically important for CBE programs. And the first one is that students should perform similarly on the CBE test as they would on other measures of that same competency. And although there's a lot of documentation for this, for the prior learning assessments, you mentioned AP or CLEP, those types of assessments, there's less documentation of that currently for CBE, some of these newer CBE programs. So one example in the literature that we found is actually from this National Cancer Action Research Team in the UK. And they developed a competency-based tool to measure technical surgical performance. And the way that they related that to another measure is they found that people who performed highly on their CBE assessment then had fewer surgical errors in an observation measure in the actual surgical room. So you can see how there's sort of two measures that are giving you that same answer. The last piece here is ultimately CBE programs seek to give their students the knowledge, skills, and abilities that they need to be successful in the future. And so it's important that they track into those future outcomes. And so I'm going to show you two outcomes from Excelsior College from their nursing graduates. It's not tied explicitly to the assessment, but it is for students who successfully complete that program. And the first one here is that students that complete that CBE program go on to pass the nursing licensure exam, the NCLEX, at rates similar to students that are not in CBE programs or the rest of the nation. The other future outcome that they report is related to work outcomes. So in doing a survey of nursing supervisors, these are the employees that receive the CBE graduates, the majority of them say that the CBE graduates from Excelsior are just as competent or more competent in clinical competence as traditional graduates, and they would be likely to hire them again. So again, some examples there related to assessment design. The second piece that's really important is determining your thresholds for mastery. So when is competency awarded? How well do you have to perform to award competency? And again, there's 5 steps here in an evidence-based process to set that performance level. And the first step is to define the relevant outcomes. Here I have an example from Lipscomb University. They've got 4 performance levels associated with their program, and each of those performance levels is associated with a content-based competency description, as well as a future-oriented employment level. So 2 examples here, if you can read them or not, but at the basic level for the influence competency, these are students that respond and listen attentively, and that's associated with like an entry-level individual employee. However, at the master level, at the other end, this is someone who can influence an organization at all levels through strong communication, impactful messages, and personal appeal. And this is more associated with someone at an executive level. I'm going to combine steps 2 and 3 for time, but it's really about designing, conducting, and synthesizing studies that directly relate to those types of claims that were in those outcome descriptions. So there's the content claims or those descriptions of the competencies, and the way this is typically done in thinking about performance levels is to bring in a group of stakeholders and have them review the assessment tasks and answer the question, how well would a successful candidate perform on this particular task? And they go through sets of tasks that way. The advanced placement program does this. They bring in professors as well as high school teachers to go through and review the items and make that judgment. Western Governors University has also done this, where they've brought in faculty and external experts to review the assessment and make those judgments about what a successful candidate would look like. What we haven't seen CBE programs do in setting those initial competency thresholds, at least documented, is having links to future outcomes. So linking test performance to future outcomes to determine competency thresholds. The advanced placement program, again, does this. They give their test to college students, and they ask the question sort of, what's the typical AP score for a student who gets an A in this class, for a student who gets a B in this class? And they use that information to decide the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 performance levels that are associated with the advanced placement exam. In the next step, it's important to bring all of the data together for the relevant stakeholders. Who would be relevant stakeholders for CBE programs? Well, you have the instructor of the course that the assessment is about, but I think you also have those who will receive those students. That could include other faculty, employers, industry experts, so sort of a few people who might be relevant stakeholders. The 5th step then, that final step, is continuing to collect data, or starting to collect data if programs haven't done this as part of their initial standard setting. And what you may find is you may need to raise or lower that bar, raise or lower that competency threshold based on data, so that students are not held back unnecessarily, but they're also not passed on without the skills that they need to be successful later. So based on our review, we found that most CBE programs have focused on defining the competencies and frameworks, and that is absolutely the first step needed for successful assessment. There's a lot of documentation about the competencies and the types of assessments that are being used to measure them. Less documentation, however, clearly links those assessments with those competencies in a really explicit way. But more importantly, we urge CBE programs to link their assessments and their mastery thresholds to those relevant future outcomes, such as success in the next course or success in the workplace. These types of data take time to collect and require creating that type of infrastructure, but they're critical evidence to support the efficacy and the future growth of CBE programs. Thank you.
That was great. That was a lot of information in not so many minutes. So well done.
You can read the paper.
Yes.
There's a
Read the paper. That goes for all of them. Highly recommend reading all the papers. But the examples in your paper were particularly interesting to me as somebody who talks about competency-based education a lot, but hasn't seen a whole lot about what the assessments are testing. So recommend reading the paper. Next, we're going to hear from Chip Franklin. Chip is a vice president of Parthenon EY. It used to just be the Parthenon Group, but in between they partnered up with Ernst & Young. And he's a full-time member of Parthenon's education group. And Chip and his colleague Rob Lytle wrote a great paper based on a survey of employers, but a survey of hiring managers mainly, to ask them, what do you know about competency-based education and how do you feel about it? And to my knowledge, it's the first of its kind, I think, that actually asks about this generically. So again, recommend reading the paper, and let's hear from Chip.
Thanks, Andrew. So all the discussion so far really starts with competency-based education as this sort of big idea with lots of potential, particularly for students. Lower cost, faster time to degree, what that means for employability, lower debt levels, all those things I think are very real. But as we look at that promise of competency-based education in particular, there's one perspective that I think has often been ignored, and that's that of the employers. I think obviously you sort of step back and think about the way this all works. And I was excited to see you include employers as a key stakeholder, because I feel like most people actually don't. In order for the whole thing to work, in order for the value proposition of really any degree, but in particular a competency-based degree, to be completed, you need the employer to recognize that that's a valid form of degree, of credentialing. You need an employer to, in effect, change their practices such that they are willing to hire people coming out of this kind of a program. You need them to recognize that the assessments are valid, that the programs are valid, and that the students coming out of these programs have actually done what they said they've done, which is learn a specific set of skills, mastered a specific set of competencies that make them relevant for the job that they're trying to seek. So our perspective in all of this was to step back from the student focus or the institutional focus and really think about what do employers think about this model, about this approach, and about what it would mean for them to actually change their practices and complete that value proposition that we think is so important. So when we started asking that question, we actually went and asked that question. We surveyed around 500 hiring managers at a wide range of employers across the country and asked them a set of questions, both about competency-based education in particular, but also about their hiring practices. So questions like, how are you meeting your human capital needs? Where are you recruiting students? Where are you finding them? What are the gaps? Where do you find those job applicants and how are they successful? Do you even know what competency-based education is? Does the idea resonate? Does it mean something to you? What competencies are most important to you? Or even more importantly, what criteria do you use when evaluating a student? And how does that translate back to competency-based education? Again, all these questions are critical to understanding whether an employer will look at a student coming out of a competency-based program and say, I recognize your mastery of these competencies as a valid input into my human capital needs. So we went and asked those people, and there's some data here, just lots of industries, right? 500 responses from a wide range of industries, companies large and small across the country. I mean, is this a representative sample of the country? Hard to say. The actual experts to my right and out in the audience could tell me, but a good sample of hiring managers from a wide variety of companies answering these questions on competency-based education and their hiring practices more generally. You've also heard this idea that there's a skills gap, that employers are unsatisfied with the graduates of traditional programs or the people that are seeking their jobs today. I think we heard validation of that through this sample. This is a chart of the 479 respondents that took our survey, and the response to the question, to what extent do you agree that educational institutions are preparing students for the work they will be doing upon graduation? on a 1 to 7 scale, 7 being I very much agree with that, and 1 I don't at all agree. You can see that under 20% were willing to say 6 or 7. I really agree that the people coming to my firm looking for a job have the skills they need or have been well prepared based on their academic experience. So that's a starting point. I don't think that's surprising to anybody, but a relevant and important starting point when you start to think about employers and that value proposition that we're trying to offer to students. We then asked what their challenges were as employers. What are their biggest fundamental problems when they look at the job applicants they see and their needs in trying to fill their human capital pipeline? There's a range of things on here. I've tried to color the ones that are most addressable by competency-based education, but the biggest point is that nothing jumps to the top. There's a lot of sort of different issues that people struggle with. The biggest one on the bottom is finding enough qualified applicants. So defining what you need people to have, the competence they need to have, finding the right people, getting the right people through the pipeline. The challenges that employers face are wide, varied, and largely addressable by a competency-based education program. Let's stop there and think about what that means. A competency-based program actually articulates very discreetly what a job candidate brings to the table. They have mastered a specific set of competencies outlined, as you've heard in the previous 2 presentations, very specifically over the course of study they've been through. So theoretically, if this whole link works between college and the career, an employer could look at those competencies and say, well, these are the ones that I need, so I know you have them. You've actually demonstrated that mastery. It's like a resume that actually reads specifically what an employer needs. Think about, again, the opportunity to really match those up is pretty significant. And again, looking at the challenges that employers face, a lot of the issues that they see in the marketplace could be pretty well addressed by a competency-based program. So given all of that, maybe the most important question, did employers even know what a competency-based program was? The answer by and large was no. At the top of this chart, and about 10% of the people that we surveyed thought they had a pretty good idea of what a competency-based program was. Almost 40% of the space maybe had an idea, but almost 60% really had no clue. Couldn't tell you what it meant, couldn't tell you what a student coming out of a competency-based program was supposed to look like, couldn't tell you how that might better impact their needs as an employer in filling those job openings. So that's an important starting point. Again, if you think about the point we've tried to belabor a little bit here, that for it all to work, employers need to recognize that a competency-based program can really give them what they need. This number needs to go up. Employers need to know about competency-based education and know what it can do for them. Even more interestingly, when you then ask a follow-up question, once you've sort of explained it to them, outlined what a competency-based program is and what a graduate might bring to the table in terms of those specifically articulated competencies, their recognition of the validity of a competency-based program, which is the green bar, and this is the percent of our sample answering a 6 or 7 on a 7-point scale, so agreeing that it was valid in green and that they were interested in hiring folks from those programs in blue, really changed based on how aware they were of the program. And maybe this is common sense, but for people that said they got it, they know what a competency-based program is, they understand the term, they understand the concept, they were much more likely to, A, think it a valid form of academic progress for a student to make. That's the far right-hand green bar. And they're also very interested in hiring students coming out of those programs. Again, for people that actually know about it, the value proposition works. For people who don't, it doesn't. It's a pretty clear trajectory. So again, the answer there might be simple, right? Awareness, raise awareness, market the heck out of this thing. Tell people what it is that they're getting and make sure employers understand that the students you're producing, the graduates that are coming out of your program, have the skills that they need. Close the skills gap, give employers what they need, give students the job they need. That all really makes sense. Just make all those numbers the same, and you've got a pretty strong value proposition. So here's the challenge. Employers don't know what they need. We asked the question, have you actually defined the competencies that you need to in your hires? So if you have a job posting, sure, you know what someone needs to do, but have you actually thought about, as an employer, the competencies that job requires? And only 20% of all of these hiring managers had actually created a formal list of the competencies needed for that job. Now, almost half have at least thought about it, have an informal list, but that's a remarkable 50% of the market that doesn't have a list or has barely even thought about it. So again, if you think about what we just tried to say, that increasing awareness, make people aware, spread the word will work. if the employers haven't even done it, how are you going to get them to understand what a student bringing a list of competencies that they've mastered actually is to what the potential is for their organization? So that was a really big point. And I have no more data, just that one. I'm going to leave that up there because I think that's pretty important. And talk for the last minute about the path forward. And again, awareness is obviously important based on some of the data that we've seen already. But I think there are very real opportunities here for competency-based programs to partner much more directly with employers to address this question, to help them develop that formalized list of competencies so you can actually start to match between what an institution does in providing a set of learning experiences, a set of demonstrated mastery against specific competencies, against what an employer needs. Because right now, clearly, based on this data, no matter how much you raise awareness, that match doesn't exist. So for employers and institutions to work much more closely together is a real opportunity. Now, that happens. Some of the people who do that, sitting next to me, John, and many others, are working very closely with employers to try and do that, but it's clearly not enough. So if you actually want this value proposition to be realized, if we want competency-based education to be relevant, not just for students and the faster, cheaper, better outcomes that Robert has talked about, if we want employers to actually be willing to hire them and make the whole thing work, we need to do a lot more in helping employers catch up with what some leading academic institutions have already been doing. Thanks.
Thank you, Chip. Lots to chew on there for John Ebersol. John is the president of Excelsior College and has been since 2006. Before that, he was an associate provost at Boston University, both Boston University and Colorado State University. And before that was assistant dean and director of strategic planning at one of my alma maters, the University of California, Berkeley. John, look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank AEI, and I want to thank each of the panelists for really doing some important work and sharing some very well researched and presented findings. I thought I would confine my remarks to three things. One, I'm not taking it for granted that the audience is familiar with Excelsior College, so I'm just going to give you a very brief idea of who we are. Then I want you to know about our associate degree in nursing program, which we maintain is the oldest and largest competency-based program in the country. And then there are just a couple of comments that I'd like to add to each of the three presentations you've heard. First off, Excelsior is unusual for a number of reasons. It was created in 1971 by the Commissioner of Higher Education and the Chancellor of the Board of Regents in the state of New York. It offered zero instruction for its first 25 years. No instruction whatsoever, though it was a Middle States accredited institution for all of that period of time. And as some of you know, the state of New York is recognized by the department as a accrediting body in its own right. I think it's the only state where that's the case. Over the we went from being essentially a aggregator, assessor, advisor, awarding institution, specifically focused on, that was our research state, which was created at the same time, was placed on the system and has continued to operate under SUNY to this day. Over the next couple of years, as was suggested by Andrew, both Charter Oak, and one we missed was Granite State, have all been more or less created along the same idea, where as early as the 1970s, we were looking at how learning from multiple sources fit together and validating that the pieces that were being put together were appropriately academic and within the spirit of what faculty wanted to see in order to have a valid credential awarded. In those days, we could accept 100% of your degree requirements in transfer. Can't do that anymore. The associate degree nursing, well, let me just finish that line of thought. In 2000, go back to 1998, we actually were given an independent. We were no longer housed in the Department of Education for the state of New York, and we became an independent unaffiliated, not-for-profit. And frankly, it was the best thing ever happened to us. In 2001, we were forced to change our name, however. And so up to that point, all that brand equity that had been accumulated was lost. And we have been working diligently since 2001 to get people to know who Excelsior College is. The Associate Degree Nursing Program is the largest program of its kind in the world. We currently enroll 18,000 students in that program. And in that program, we have graduated over its 40 years just under 50,000 practicing registered nurses. This program, by the way, has been subjected to all kinds of outcome validity testing. Not only do we track our performance against the national examination, the NCLEX that Katie mentioned, we also have engaged the likes of Stanford Research Institute and pro-evaluators whose report, the executive summary of their report is in the front foyer here. We want independent third parties to evaluate what it is that we have achieved, or what our graduates have.
hear you on the live stream if you don't.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not sure why we're not working here.
Sounds okay over here.
Okay, all right. So third-party assessment is also a part of it, as well as regular surveying both of our graduates and of their employers after the fact. There's a book that is out today called Call to Nursing. And in this book, Call to Nursing, are 25 profiles of graduates of our program, and they are representative of the success that these students have gone on to enjoy. So there's anecdotal evidence as well as statistical. While it's not part of the conversation today, there's another report that I think came out a little earlier that Andrew and his group have promoted called the regulatory challenges of the competency-based education. And I have to tell you, there are some tremendous challenges. We have spent millions and millions of dollars over our 40 years defending this pioneering model of preparing nurses. And it's a battle that we have not won. We will have a team from Washington State visiting in just a couple of weeks to determine whether or not they want to continue to recognize our CBE graduates. There's some important points, and I want to just touch on each one of them. In the first case, our lack of precision around what we mean with our different terms certainly is a challenge that we need to address. It's hurting our credibility. When the academic community can't come together and say, this is what we mean by this term, it has individuals wondering if we know what we're doing otherwise. The term competency actually is given to us by the employer community, and we need to continue to determine that competence means demonstrated ability to apply learning. So it's not just about what you know, it's also about what you can do with it. And so this element of demonstration, I contend, is extremely important to competency. Mastery, on the other hand, you can master a subject without necessarily demonstrating education. And certainly that's where AP, many people don't know it, but coming out of the Regents of the state of New York, we've been in the testing business since 1971 and actually preceded the College Board and the CLEP program. Those exams absolutely are psychometrically prepared, nationally normed, field tested, have cut scores, and letter grades assigned to them, and results are put on a transcript from a regionally accredited institution. So no difficulty in having other institutions recognize and accept that. So I want to just, I know I'm out of time here, but I just want to say that getting us in agreement around terminology is important. I couldn't agree with Katie more about the importance of assessment. If we don't have valid assessments, and if we don't have the employer community at the table working with us on those assessments, we're going to have a problem, and it's ultimately going to sow the seeds of a bigger problem in the acceptance of this movement. The fact that the employer community doesn't know anything about it, I think the academics have to take some responsibility for that. Our faculties have not reached out to employers to involve them either in identifying the competencies, which, by the way, are given to us in the field of nursing. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Now we're going to hear from Carol Geary-Schneider. Carol is the president of the Association of American Colleges and Universities, AAC&U, another acronym for everybody to remember. It's an organization devoted to advancing and strengthening undergraduate liberal education, and Carol's also been involved in the degree qualifications profile, a Lumina-funded effort to actually define what undergraduate degrees mean, a relevant conversation for today's topic. So thank you, Carol, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and good afternoon, everyone. There is a handout for this session, so I hope you picked it up because I will be referring to it. I'm guessing that initially I was asked, partly because of our work with the degree qualifications profile, a framework for the broader expectations of undergraduate degrees at the associate level, the BA level, and the MA level. But probably there was an assumption that as the head of the leading organization committed to liberal education that I might be skeptical about competency-based education. So I want to start by disabusing you of that notion. My very first job out of graduate school way back in the day was in fact working with returning adult learners in a University Without Walls program funded by the Ford Foundation, one of a whole network defining competency-based education for returning adults. I had to start cold, as you did, Bob, on the question of what do we mean by competency, and for that matter, what do we mean by liberal arts? We were offering a liberal arts competency-based degree to working adults. A lot of basic questions emerged from all that. I long ago moved away from the term competency because I saw even back in the 70s and 80s that it was being used to describe maybe 15 or 20 different objectives for a course. And you multiply that by the usual structure of a degree, and you're into a zoo. So I stopped using that language until Lumina invited me to come back to help think through the competencies for a 21st century degree. But the larger point is this. I left my work with returning adult learners convinced of a couple of things. One, that the more we could be explicit in explaining what it was we thought different parts of the degree and the degree as a whole was supposed to achieve, the more we could actually work on students' demonstration and development of proficiencies, competencies. We use the term learning outcomes a lot in my association. The more we could do that, the better we could serve the very diverse student bodies that are coming to our campuses, not just older people coming back to school with some work experience, but all those significantly underprepared first-generation students that I also was seeing early in my career once I left graduate school. So AAC&U has been an enthusiastic proponent of clarifying the intended learning outcomes for all degrees. We've been a leader in moving students' own actual work to the center of our question of whether or not they are competent. And I agree with what I think John was saying about the AP exams. Those measure usually your ability to read a document and answer some questions or just to survive multiple choice questions, but they don't do what I actually did long ago in an AP class in high school, which was learn how to do a research paper. They don't teach you how to do history. So there's a lot of things that are masquerading as certifying performance that do not actually prepare a student to use the skills and knowledge beyond the immediate venue for practicing and demonstrating. So AAC&U has also moved into this whole area of how we actually help students develop the competencies. And in the degree qualifications profile, you have a summary of it on the back of my handout, but in the document itself, it says that a proficiency usually involves the combination of knowledge of different sorts, skills of different sorts, and the application of a complex problem that doesn't have one single answer, that the student is having to think through things for herself. And that's where I really want to focus my few remarks today. I think we want to make a distinction between the knowledge you need to know to get through a course or a course equivalency or a substitute exam, and the cross-cutting competencies that make it possible for you to use your learning beyond the immediate site of its acquisition. So what we really want, and we do a lot of work with employers. We've done umpteen surveys with employers. They're hand-in-glove partners in our work on liberal education. And we know that overwhelmingly they say that the thing that really most is needed in their workplace is the capacities to deal with the unknown, with emerging problems, with problems that are still being solved, not to work to rule, but to deal with all the questions to which we don't yet know the answer and where we will have to figure that out together. So on the handout that I've given you, the latest of our surveys shows the percentage of employers who consider certain kinds of learning absolutely essential to succeed in their workplace. And it's broad knowledge of the arts and sciences, also of democracy, not yet mentioned in this discussion, knowledge of cultures inside the United States, outside the United States, a long list of intellectual skills, none of which can be developed in one short course, but all of which need to be practiced again and again and again in different contexts before we can say that students are proficient in them. There's a set of what we call personal and social responsibilities that go to the fact that we are educating students with competencies or proficiencies they need for democracy, to work through problems that we need to solve as a society together. And what we like first century liberal art, the last category, which is that students can actually integrate and apply their learning to a new setting, a new context. Not just that they know how to give medicines, but that they know how to figure out what medicines, a new disease actually. And they know who to ask. They won't be doing it alone. They'll be doing that collaboratively. We also have been the only national association to keep lifting up the bad evidence, which I've given you some of on this page, that students coming through traditional higher education are leaving without most of those broad-cutting, cross-cutting proficiencies that I've been talking about. That wherever we have evidence that we don't have nearly enough, it's bad evidence. So ETS, not my favorite tests, but when they're telling me that 9% of college seniors are proficient in writing, or 9% are proficient in math. And when we know from many studies that people are losing ground in quantitative reasoning between the beginning and the end of college, even though I may not like those tests, I think that they are pointing to real problems. So in that context, the big recommendation that we're making is that we spend much more time than we have in the competency-based zone or the student learning zone generally in how students are actually helped to develop these capacities that they need for democracy, need for success in their own careers. And that calls our attention back to the assignments they're being given and whether or not they're actually being given assignments that allow them not just to demonstrate the competency, but to practice it. Are they being given constant writing assignments, constant research assignments, constant problem-solving assignments? How often does ethical research come up? It's a desired employer proficiency. Is it in fact something we're working on? And one could go on. So I think the center of this whole discussion of whether we call it competency or proficiency or learning outcomes is really whether or not programs are organized, not just to recognize whether or not students are bringing certain skills back from work, and some are, but are we really ensuring that they are practicing multiple ways in which acquire and then become responsible for using that they will need for democracy and for careers. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Thank you to all the panelists for great remarks. I'll take the prerogative of asking the first few questions from the podium here. John referenced the paper on the regulatory environment, which was just released last week, and Chris Murray from Thompson Coburn, one of the co-authors, is here. His colleague Aaron Lacey was the other co-author. Highly recommend reading that paper. And it's not just a plug, it's actually a lead into my question. And that is, when we start to talk about regulation and law and demonstration projects and pilots and so on, we run into this question very quickly of defining this space, right? And defining who gets to participate in a government grant or government program that's designed to facilitate CBE and who doesn't. And so I wanted to start, John referenced this. I wanted to first ask John and then go to Robert, because his paper talks about this as well, John, why is it so hard to define this, number one? And it sounds like you think it's critical that we do, and how should we go about it? And what do you think the process is for actually setting out a definition that policymakers might be able to use as they try to facilitate this work?
I'm glad you gave me an easy question. I think we first have to just accept the fact that we're talking about CBE. And the C doesn't mean proficiency. C doesn't mean mastery. C stands for competence. So let's accept that. And I think there is agreement that the demonstration is an important element of this process. It's more than just understanding that which can be measured by a true-false multiple choice questionnaire. I recently had the folks at edX tell me that they didn't need psychometrically prepared assessments for the people coming through their program. If it was an exam written by a member of the faculty at Harvard or MIT, that was good enough for them. Of course, I didn't ask how many of them had had psychometric training. But when a faculty member in artificial intelligence is preparing the exam, I first off think we've got a problem with self-interest. I also think we have a problem with just the mechanics. But that's sort of an aside. I think that the work you're doing here, Andrew, is going a long way towards raising awareness, providing an opportunity to engage in open discussion. And I'm not someone known for being particularly patient with process, but it's important in government and education, I'm learning.
Robert, what was your verdict from trying to define this? I remember we did have a convening here, but as this project was getting underway, and I think we spent probably the first 50% of it trying to define it, and quickly ran out of time for the rest of the agenda. But what were the key components in your mind of a definition, and why do you think it's so difficult to define?
So I intentionally took a fairly broad definition of competency-based education because we couldn't agree on a definition everyone liked, and in part because if I had a broad definition, it would bring people to the table to discuss this further. So the short answer here is help. But part of that is I'm a finance person. I'm not an expert in what would be competency-based education. But bringing together all these programs that could qualify under various definitions, I think, is valuable. And then let people with more expertise in defining competency-based education go from there.
I want to make the argument that whether you call it competency or proficiency, but let's just leave that open for the minute, that the degree qualifications profile has tried very hard to answer this question. It is said that somebody who's completing an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree, let's just stick with those, has acquired the combination of broad knowledge about the larger society in which they're a part, specialized knowledge relevant to the field they want to pursue, a set of cross-cutting intellectual skills that virtually every employer will say are critical to success in the enterprise, that they have also acquired knowledge, skill, and actual applied experience in working on civic problems because we're educating them for democracy, and that they have demonstrated their ability, their capacities in collaborative and applied learning. And the authors of the DQP were very intentional in putting applied learning in there, recognizing all those adult learners and some younger ones who have knowledge and skill that can bring to the table and demonstrate some other way than by going through a traditional curriculum. But I want to argue that this is your definition, and I'm actually sorry that you didn't use it, because it would do a lot of good for us to rally around the notion of this integration of broad, specialized skills and various kinds of applications, civic, practical, et cetera, to rally around that in order to fight off something else that is happening, which is people selling courses that are content only. I think that's where you're going. They're doing multiple choice tests, psychometrically approved or not. There's no competence that a multiple choice test gets at other than recognition.
Right.
recognition, which is a small part of larger capacities that we want to develop. But they're calling them competencies. And so when somebody has covered the quizzes and the tests, now they're said to be competent in X. And this is just so far short of what we actually need for students to take with them from our programs that I think it would be useful, really, for us to rally around, useful both for working adults and for traditional age students, this broad and field tested. This was put out for beta testing by over 400 institutions. We strengthened it in the second round after we got feedback from the field, but in fact, there was a great deal of assent to all this.
So would you say that traditional liberal arts colleges are inherently competency-based?
Good ones, yes, but inarticulate. And this is really where I started way back when. I valued a lot that I got in my own liberal arts education, but I didn't carry with me a language that went beyond I was a history major. Or something, I'm thinking of a very elite women's college. I visited, not my own alma mater, a while ago, and the students said, well, we study a lot of different things here. That's what it means to get a liberal arts education. And I cringed. Because if that's the best we're doing by way of giving students a language to describe what they can do with their learning, we're shortchanging them and we're shortchanging the enterprises for which they're being prepared. So I think that the best liberal education in strong universities, honors programs everywhere, including community colleges, are developing those cross-cutting transferable capacities, but they don't always give people a language to do it, to describe what they're getting.
Sorry, go on.
Just very quickly, Andrew, and I don't mean this as a criticism, Carol, but I do think that you point out what is part of the problem of why this is such a difficult thing for us to deal with, because there has been a very substantial investment in other frames and other frameworks. And I certainly think this has been the case with the DQP. I also think we're talking to the wrong people. The judges of competence aren't academics. Mm-hmm. The judges of competence are employers, and we haven't been talking to them.
So I think that's a great transition to a question I have for Katie and Matt. Playing devil's advocate for a second. I read your paper about best practices and applying it to CBE. Is that fair? That seems like a high bar compared to what traditional colleges, I think, as Carol is pointing out, right? They're not particularly articulate about describing exactly what it is they're doing. So aren't CBE providers just so much further ahead in some ways than traditional higher ed in sort of writing these things down and assessing them? Are they sort of ahead of the game, or am I reading that wrong?
I think that they are ahead of the game when it comes to defining the competencies and building those frameworks, and I think there are a lot of programs that have done that really well. I think, however, when we think about programs being accredited based on direct assessment and not credit hour, the quality of that assessment should come under high scrutiny, because that is what the credential is based on, is that set of assessment and skills. And I think especially for there are programs that have been around for a long time and have sort of a history of data collection, but for the growth that we're seeing and the number of programs that seem to be coming into the market, it's going to be really important for them to be able to have this evidence to show the value of what they're doing. Employers, though they may not exactly understand what a history major is or a liberal arts student is, they've been working with those students and hiring those students for a long time. There's still a lot of awareness to grow in the competency-based education side. And again, for students to be able to come in and say, I can demonstrate these competencies, and here's the evidence that says, based on these assessments, based on these things, I have a credential that I can actually do this, I think is extremely important.
So what do you think traditional colleges might learn from competency-based providers right now? And I'd ask the same of Carol and John if they wanted to weigh in too.
Yeah, I think there is a stronger movement across the board to really trying to better define and measure learning outcomes. I don't think that those are standardized by they necessarily need to be, but I think being able to provide that evidence, again, the explicit link between the assessments that are given in a course, the activities that students are asked to do, and a lot of these are performance-based tasks where students are engaged in real-world activities or simulations of those real-world activities, and being able to explicitly link those demonstrations to the competencies, I think it's something that can be done in a variety of educational programs.
I think what's sometimes missed is that this is all part of a huge continuum. I'm an historian. I do tend to look at this historically, a continuum of slow-moving but nonetheless progressive change away from organizing educational experience in terms of courses, credit hours, et cetera. For over 2 decades, the accreditors have been asking institutions as part of the accreditation process to define their learning outcomes. When I went to the table to work on the DQP, I carried with me a survey of half of our members, and we're a very representative organization, half public, half private, 2-year, 4-year, selective, broad access. What outcomes are you requiring? And there's nothing in the DQP that fewer than 2/3 of all our members said they were requiring. In most cases, it was 90-some%. Now, to have said we want these outcomes is not necessarily to have organized to help students achieve them. I'm not claiming that. But nonetheless, a movement toward defining the outcomes is broad-based across higher education, program by program, and so are some reforms that actually would allow us to take a look at whether or not students can use their knowledge. So, for example, and my association's been pushing this for 20 years, I'm gratified to see from the National Study of Student Engagement that 47% of graduating seniors say they're doing something called culminating work, usually connected with their major, sometimes broader. That culminating work ought to be the location for our final inspection of whether or not they've acquired the analytic reasoning skills, the communication skills, the ethical reasoning skills, some knowledge of the larger social significance, however they choose to define it, of what they're working on. In other words, we have a sort of baseline, half students doing it, half not. I don't claim it's all good. It isn't. But nonetheless, I think we should be aiming for what the nurses do, which is not just pass a test showing that they recognize the information, but that they can actually pull together a complex simulation, a situation, and actually apply various kinds of knowledge and skill to new advanced problems. I think that's where we need to go with this, with the assessment of this. And this is a movement in the making. The more we can do to push it forward, the better off this society will be.
And then that future link too that the nursing assessment does to future outcomes.
Yeah.
That is associated with future success and being prepared for the types of things that are claimed to be prepared for.
It's interesting that the National Nursing Examination has no measurement whatsoever of clinical skill, which of course is the primary point upon which we are criticized because of our reliance upon experience and competence developed in the work setting as the main reason for, or the main way in which clinical skills are gained, but yet they have to demonstrate those. But to your question about what would I tell traditionally, with falling birth rates, with more and more schools not able to attract the number of students that they need, with some estimates being as low as 15% of 18 to 24-year-old full-time students, and 85% being the older, working full-time, studying part-time, there needs to be more focus on the part of traditional education on serving the adult. And this needs to be one, but just one, of the options that's available to those post-traditional students.
Before we go open it up, just a quick question for Chip, who hasn't spoken in a while, so I want to give him a chance to get in. So, Carol mentioned the survey results that they've produced about employers valuing sort of these broader domains rather than some of these specific skills. First, is that something that came out in your survey? Number one, and number two, do we see those things as necessarily mutually exclusive in terms of CBE models being able to measure and assess some of those broader domains?
So I think to the bigger question, yes, the broader skills are something that employers in your research and our research, I think everywhere are saying is critically important for the people they look to bring into their organizations. And that's across industries, that's across levels, that's at the entry level, it's at the senior level. I think actually one of the interesting things about our research, we looked really hard to find differences across those respondents by industry, by size of company, by level of position for which they were hiring. And there's almost no statistically significant difference in the way that people thought about the way they hired, the importance of competencies, the importance of the different criteria they use to evaluate candidates. So it was remarkably similar across all of those, and everybody focused on the general skills that are really important here. I think the critical link to competency-based education, the questions we're having, is that I think competency-based education, it's easy for you to start to think about it as really specific, tactical, almost vocational skills that people are learning, that it's you learn how to do this and you demonstrate it. So the focus on nursing and even clinical skills, those are very tactical things, or some of them are very tactical, specific skills that you can demonstrate. But I think competency-based education, if you look at the DQP or at the way that other programs are developing their own list of competencies, they place a huge emphasis on the general skills, the creative, critical thinking skills that are at the heart of a liberal arts degree, that are at the heart of even more technical degrees, and in making sure that students not only learn that kind of stuff, but they can demonstrate its application. And so I think part of the problem here is that we have a communication issue. You know, we just had a big discussion around what we're measuring, how we're measuring it, whether schools are actually thinking about defining their learning objectives. That's all critically important, but I think we're not communicating that well to students or to the employers. And again, I don't think the employers are the only link here. It's just one that we think gets ignored a lot. But if a student can't articulate what their learning objectives have been, what they've learned, why being at a liberal arts degree is important to those critical creative thinking skills that help them be a lifelong citizen in an active democracy and whatever else you want to say about it, then we've failed. A competency-based program is a better way, a more specific way to articulate some of those specific things that you have not just learned, but demonstrated over the course of your program. So again, a degree is a marker, whether it's your major or the prestige of the school that you come from. Those are really the biggest things that or employers are evaluating. A competency-based program allows you to get underneath that. And for anyone who's trying to hire based on a transcript, you know that it's impossible to tell whether that's good or bad, whether they've taken the right courses or the wrong courses, unless maybe you went to that school, which is why people go back and recruit at the schools that they went to. But so it's a communication issue. I think CBE is a way to better articulate what a student has learned and demonstrate that starts to dig in a little bit more underneath the traditional markers of a degree or the institution the degree comes from.
I will say
I'm going to
in this
open
context.
up for questions.
Okay.
Sorry, we're running out of
Right.
time. I want to make sure we get everybody in. Please raise your hand. Wait for the mic. Identify yourself by name and affiliation. I've seen a hand up first, and it's Cliff in the back here.
Gentleman from the Institute for Higher Education Policy, colleague of Carol Schneider's in many efforts, including writing the degree qualifications profile. This is real questions, Andrew, I promise you.
Terrific.
Raise your hand, panelists, if any of you, if you have read any of the documents and studies to emerge from OECD's DSIGO project, that's Design and Selection of Competencies, which ran for 5 years. Raise your hand if you've read any of them. No. Okay, second question. All right?
But I trusted you to have done it.
Okay, no, it's important in this respect because this is about language. It's not about competency-based education. It's about that white noise we call competence, okay? I'd like to see each person here do a one-sentence definition of competence. I didn't say competency-based. You.
Doing a good job.
Doing a good job. Next, Katie.
Being able to apply what you've learned in different environments.
Okay. Go ahead, Chip. Competence, not competency-based.
Being able to do something.
I would agree with that one.
I think of it as adequately able to do something, sufficiently, but not necessarily distinctively.
Okay. I can show you in the literature 11 different definitions of competence in the U.S. literature that even thinks about something called competency, let alone competency-based education. Where Carol's right is that there are different contexts for competence. John, I thought you came close to it, and I would hope that we'd be able to identify these in the future before we got into any of the topics that were addressed today. Everybody from a different angle ought to be able to tell us what it is they're writing about at depth. I've got a paper on this. If you want it, I'll give it to you. It's got a reading list, but it helps, Andrew, if you ask everybody who's going to write a paper in the future, please tell us before you begin, what do you mean by competence?
Thank you.
Then
That's
we can
that's
talk
a
about
that's
something
a
else.
that's a
Okay, bye-bye.
wonderful piece of feedback. Thank you, Cliff. Sounds like the Eskimo word for snow, right? There's 200 Eskimo words for snow. It's not really clear to me if there are 11 different ones, though. How anybody would be able to define just one to your satisfaction. Anyway, next question. I see one in the back, and then we'll come to this gentleman up front, right here, Isaac. It's hiding behind the pillar there.
Hi, Neil Allison with Pearson. Thank you to the panelists. A quick question on the issue of assessment. It seems to me that doing it well is difficult. Is it possible for each institution to adequately assess these competencies themselves? And is there an opportunity for institutions to work together to communicate those assessments and competencies across industries, across the economy?
Sure. I think programs that have, I think it takes a lot of resources, and I think you can talk a little bit about what you guys have done at Excelsior. We tried to give some examples in the paper of things that schools could do to be able to bolster some of that evidence, thinking about, like, one example when we talk about relations to other measures of the similar competency. Multiple schools that have a measure of problem solving could collaborate together and have students take both of those measures, again, providing evidence about problem solving. That seems to fit well for some of those broader general skills. And so thinking about how schools that have interest in similar competencies could come together to try to create common assessments. Other institutions have licensed assessments from other providers that have already done a lot of the work and doing some reliability or validity.
I think that institutions are going to have to come together and collaborate and work with appropriate industry groups or employer groups, because I think this is going to become eventually a point of differentiation. That the validity of the assessment, I think Katie has nailed it, is if the validity of the assessment comes under criticism, it's going to erode across a wider spectrum than just any one particular program, I think.
If I could make a couple of comments, one of the most widely touted competency-based program is Western Governors University, and when we were writing the DQP, we tried very hard to get access to what they were using as their assessments. They keep them secret. I don't think that's a practice we're going to be able to stand behind. But right now, I said before that students' own work is the best evidence of whether or not they've been practicing and demonstrating some of the cross-cutting competencies we're talking about. And right now, there's a big national effort going on, funded by Gates and by Spencer and by in, I think it's now 13 states. Some 80 institutions have agreed to use a set of previously validated scoring rubrics for specific, widely expected capacities like critical thinking, like communication, like quantitative reasoning. Some of them are also working on civic learning, integrative learning, ethical reasoning. But they are all using the same scoring rubrics. Faculty have been trained to actually use these rubrics. There's a national platform. The work is being uploaded. We're going to start doing some research studies that Spencer has made possible to take a look at the assignments. Behind these samples of student work are assignments. We assume that assignments given earlier in student study will be less complex and that assignments given later are more complex. We're going to actually look at this and see whether or not the assignments are in fact designed and executed to develop more advanced capacities. So this is work just starting, but it's, to my mind, it goes to the question of validating how much can you generalize from samples of student work, but also it was made possible because hundreds of faculty across the country agreed not just on the name of the outcome, but on the various dimensions of the capacity and what it looks like as a student gets better at it. And that's the explicitness that we need to foster. And that's the promise of this whole effort, I believe.
Next, right up here in the blue shirt, Isaac.
This actually continues the question of the previous. Chip, more than a decade ago, the Human Resources Standards Organization asked higher education associations to join in defining competencies. All declined or refused. Are there any such efforts underway now, or did the employers express any interest in that?
So if the question is, do employers express interest in a standardized version of competencies or some unified version of it? I mean, I think, yes, that's part of what will make it work. Mostly what employers wanted to know is, can you articulate what a student has demonstrated, right? Their competency, forgive the continued discussion about that word. Can you define that and articulate it to us in a way that matches against what we've done? And as we tried to show, that hasn't been done even on the employer side, which makes it harder to start to map against them. But I think employers are really interested in the dialogue with institutions of higher education to continue to try and make that match happen. But obviously they're missing a couple of ingredients on particularly one side.
I would suggest that the professions of both nursing and law enforcement are instructive here in terms of what they give us in terms of key competencies, and that we have to then, in turn, prepare people to show that they can demonstrate those competencies in some sort of an evaluative process.
John, can I ask you a follow-up, just to jump in? Because I think one of the things that Chip pointed out in his paper and his presentation is it's sort of this interesting disconnect between employers say they can't find the people with the competencies they need, but they don't even bother to find the ones they need. So it's sort of this, how do you know that you can't find them? And the question I have for you is, have you seen in your work with employers an effect on their ability to articulate what it is they're looking for or to write down some of this?
Well, it's interesting you asked that question, Andrew, because I've thought about writing an article recently that suggests that employers don't know what they want. Because when you really do boil it down, it's exactly what Carol said, that they want the things that come from a good liberal arts education. They want the ability to communicate, they want the ability to solve problems, to think critically, analytically. So it's only perhaps in these pre-professional programs where you are getting very specific in terms of the kinds of skills that are expected to be demonstrated and that we're being held responsible for instilling in them.
Other questions? I see a couple in the back here. We'll go over here first, and then we'll come up here next.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Mary Outlaw with the District of Columbia Public Schools, so thank you for having us. I did have a question. Before our students get to you all, they're with us. So is there something that we can be doing on the high school level to better prepare our students before they get to you? Is there something that we can do to give you a better product so once they get to school, they can matriculate and they don't face some of the problems that you've discussed today?
Well, let me jump right in on that. We count the ways. We do a huge amount of work on curricular change and focus with our member institutions, and lamentably, they all start out by assuming that very little can be expected from the schools from which students are coming, and they are mildly supportive, but not highly optimistic about what the Common Core standards reforms will do. But in the Common Core standards reforms are arguments that students should be doing a lot of analysis, a lot of research, a lot of projects. That's really what's being asked for, whether it's in English language arts or in math or in science. And the more students are doing that, actually, I know as a trustee of my former alma mater that the most predictive aspect of the application to college was a graded paper that the student had to submit, graded by and evaluated by a faculty member. And it wasn't the grade. The question was, what was the level of the work that the student was being asked to do in high school? And that was the indicator of whether or not that student would make it at, in this case, Mount Holyoke College, or would be floundering. So the more we have students doing really complex tasks early on, frequently and often, I like to envision, the better they'll be, I like to envision a moment when we actually, through the magic of technology, have a student's college portfolio starting in school, so that the people teaching first-year writing can take a look at the best writing delivered in the last year, preferably second semester of high school. You could use that second semester a whole lot more proficiently. And I don't think we're too far off from actually having that, so that we can use new forms of communication to help faculty members see where students are, what they've already mastered, what they need next, and far more effectively focus on powerful learning for that student.
I want to
I
give
would-
Katie the last word because we're running up against time. But
Thanks. I would like to add, Matt and I both work in the Center for College and Career Success, and so we do a lot of work on college readiness in the K-12 space and what can we do to get students prepared and how do we better predict. And so some work that we've recently published is looking all the way back at middle school and how do we identify students that are on track or not. And we see, yes, academic achievement and grades and test scores and taking honors courses and sort of the rigor is very important. But right behind it are behavior and motivation, and that those factors and really taking a broader look at the whole child and how we can intervene early in those factors and the importance that those have in predicting later behavior, later achievement, and later success in college. And so taking that broader view, we'd be happy to share that work with you.
This is an opportunity to get in a plug for something that is available to everyone in the room. With monies given to us by the federal government, the state of New York, and the Kresge Foundation, we have created a really highly interactive, highly effective online writing laboratory. It resides in the public domain. If you want to see what it looks like when it's private labeled by others, take a look at Purdue. It's also a resource that MIT is using, and it's a writing resource that anyone is free to adopt and private label. We just ask that somewhere in the small print you acknowledge our work in having put this together. But that, Ms. Outlaw, is in way of saying that we find tremendous problems with writing skills, and it's not just with recent high school graduates.
well, thank you very much, everyone, and please join me in thanking the panel. Terrific discussion. And as a plug, it's now 5:01, so I won't keep you much longer. But as a plug, please join us here at AEI June 25th. The chairman of the Help Committee, Lamar Alexander, will be here to give a keynote address on higher ed reform. So
Fantastic.
please join us, and thank you.
What's the date again?